Good afternoon, edTPAers. I am going today take you through an example of prompt 2 and 3. I am using for my sample today a elementary literacy submission. However, the prompts 2 and 3 and their corresponding rubrics are all very similar no matter what handbook you choose. So I'm looking today at this planning commentary. Questions 2 and 3 are associated with rubrics 2 and 3. So let's take a look at this question. 2 is knowledge of students to inform teaching. So basically what they want to do is they want you to consider your students in respect to the central focus. So you're going to be describing the variety of learners of the students in your class that might need different learning strategies. I implore you to think about all of your students as unique individuals and stop focusing on who has IEPs and 504s and who doesn't. You've got all kinds of students with different needs. So you're going to first describe them, and then most of that comes from when the scorer looks at it, they're comparing it with rubric 2, where they're looking to see if you're first of all describing these needs of these specific individuals, and then in the prompt 3, you'll be talking about the supports. But first of all, you've got to identify these individuals. So it is the job of this prompt 2 just for you to talk about their prior academic learning, their prerequisite skills, as related to the central focus. So we don't need everybody's academic history, but we do need to know, as far as the central focus is concerned, what do the students already know, what can they do, and what are they still learning to do. If you're still in the planning stages of your edTPA, now would be a really good time to do a pre-test, wouldn't you agree? And then that would give you a lot of information on which to go. If not, you can do just a quick assessment at the beginning of your learning segment just to kind of ascertain where you're going. Okay, then you're going to describe the personal, cultural, and community assets. So what do you know about your students' everyday experiences? What happens with them when they walk outside the door of their home? What do they see? What do they do? Who do they interact with? Think about their cultural and language background, practices, and interests. A lot of students get caught up in this cultural thing, and they think that we're wanting them to make cultural connections, like, for example, a rural elementary school in the Midwest needs to make a connection with students living in a completely different culture in another part of the world. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about how do you make this relevant to the culture that your students live in. Now, in the third prompt, this is where you justify your instructional decisions, your supports based on what you know about your students' prior academic learning, these assets that you've described, and then you describe the planned supports that you have for the whole class, the general supports for the whole class, individuals, and then groups of students who maybe have specific needs that are common. And then if there's any kind of common misconceptions or some common developmental issues that you can anticipate, that's all addressed here in prompt 3. Notice that prompt 3 also asks that you include principles from research and or theory to support your justifications. So when we look at rubric 2, so remember that when you're looking at the URLP, you can find out how these things are scored. So the information from Rubric 2 comes from a combination of prompt 2 and 3. And that is because prompt 2 describes the students, and prompt 3 you talk about how you support the students based on that description. So 2 is setting them up for 3. So the same thing with the next Rubric 3, you can see that it also gets the evidence from prompt 2 or 3. So it's kind of mixed. But Rubric 2 is what they're looking for is, do the supports that you've come up with support the students' varied learning needs? Now, you've got to pay attention to this box. You got to pay attention to it. You cannot ignore that box. And you need to think outside of the box about other students. These are just examples of varied learners. So again, if you don't have IEP and 504 students, if all your students in your class are, you think, alike in that they're gifted, I want you to say, tell me this. If you were to sit down with their parents, would their parents tell you that their child is exactly like every other child in your class? Is that what you're telling me? Because you know that's not true. Every parent of every child that you have in your classroom can very clearly tell you the difference between their child and the other children in the room. So that's what we're talking about, individual differences, regardless of the level that you're talking about. And then when you're looking at these, you want to make really clear that you're avoiding something called deficit thinking. A deficit thinking is revealed when candidates explained how low academic performance is based primarily on a student's cultural or linguistic background. This is what we refer to as a deficit view. You need to be aware of the deficit view. It is so prevalent in education. Anytime anybody in your school begins a sentence with, well, you know what their parents are like, well, you know that home that could come from. Anytime you do that, you're viewing the student through his deficits. It's a deficit view. You just can't do that. Okay, so let's take a look now at a sample, and I think that you'll find this very eye-opening. Now, this is a very high scoring sample, and nobody's papers are perfect. So I'm going to go through it. I'm going to talk to you about why it's high scoring, and we'll discuss some things I found that maybe if I'd been scoring it, I might have been a little bit more strict. So this student is writing, her central focus is comparing and contrasting, and she does talk about, she does stick to the prompt, and that is to describe the students. And basically, she sticks to that really well in prompt 2. This is only describing the students. Here is her central focus, and she talks about how she provides evidence on how she knows the skill level of her students. And so she's supporting her assertions. That's very good. Here, she's thinking about the activities that she has planned to help students with this central focus. And she's not talking about how they are supporting the students. She's talking about how she might have to support them with the activity. So she's not only anticipating what they know, what they can do as far as the central focus is concerned, she's considering how well they might do with a Venn diagram. She does here, she mentions a student that she anticipates will struggle with the assignment. She doesn't explain why, and I think that's a mistake. We don't want to just say that the student has an IEP and we expect they're going to have trouble with their skill. We need to say what specifically. She does say with writing, but what with writing? Is it a mechanical problem? Is it, is it a problem with being able to punctuate? Does he actually have trouble with forming the letters? What's going on here? Why is she saying that he is going to have trouble with this? Also, she kind of got off topic here. Remember that this entire part is only about what you know about the students. You do not start talking about how you've addressed these needs. So this really could have gone into the next part. Here she begins to describe what she knows about the students, what they enjoy doing. So she's very aware of their personal assets. And this is exactly what we mean when we say assets are related to the central focus, because she points out that they like sports and that the two texts that she have chosen are about sports, or they're at least a prominent part of the story. In this next part, she's discussing how her students might relate to the theme of literature and find relevancy. She's trying to bring in the cultural and community asset into this. It's a really valiant effort. I'm not sure I would have given it a 5, but her scorer did. So it's, she did a really good job here. But I think what she's done is that she's shown a really good reflection about how she's chosen a difficult topic of segregation. And she's fairly sure that her students are not familiar with anything about segregation. Apparently, they only have one African American student in the class. And so she's grappling with how to deal with this. Again, she does address how that one African American student in the class might relate to the stories that she's chosen. Now, again, prompt 2 is all about describing the students, their prerequisite skills, everything that they come knowing and being able to do, what they're still working on. That's what you're focusing on, plus their personal interests, the community, anything in their community or culture that relates to what they're doing and what the text is. And when I say culture, I mean, the problem is for us is that when we're living in the culture, we don't see culture. We think of culture as being people in traditional dress from different different parts of the world, dancing or maybe singing the music that we're unfamiliar with. That's not what we mean by culture. So what is their culture? When they walk, is their culture of their community centered around a church? Do y'all go to a community center to play ball? I mean, what do these kids do when they leave their house in the afternoons? So here we're going to be talking about, in this prompt here, it's where you justify, and that's a really important word. You're going to justify the learning task that you've chosen based on these qualities that you know about your students that you've described in prompt 2. So you're really going to go back to prompt 2, think about all those qualities that you mentioned. Now, how did you choose your stuff based on that? It's very important to be explicit. It's very important to refer to instructional materials and lesson plans. I want to say that this student did not do that. And yet it would have been so much stronger had she done that. For example, she could have said, on this day, on lesson 2, I'm going to do this, this, and that. If you can see on page 3 of my instructional materials, so she could have made those references. So she does here explain her choice of the text that she used based on student interests. They were interested in sports, and so she chose books based on that. She discusses the theme of segregation and why that's important in her class. She also makes a strong connection here between educational theory and her handling of the theme of segregation, which I thought this was Excellent, which and this in itself might explain her 5. Um, Here she also makes a connection between personal interests and the interest of her students in theory. So she talks about um, their personal interests, and then she applies some theoretical um, elements. She quotes John McCarthy, 2014, and talks about how that fits in there. Now, I want to draw everybody's attention to this. I think she got off scot-free on this one. What she says is most of my students come from low socioeconomic families. Sorry, I can't really say that word. Socioeconomic families, which makes it hard for students to focus in the classroom because of their home life. In my opinion, that reflects a deficit view. And so she didn't get a 1 for it, but you need to be aware that a statement like that, read by a scorer who notes that that reflects a deficit view, could cause all of your other writing to be completely miscounted, and you get a 1 for a deficit view. So it's very, very important that you check for that, check yourself, and help other people check themselves. So let's go on now to the next prompt, 3B. And this is where we're no longer talking about the instructional strategies, the planning for the lesson, but now we're talking about the strategies and the supports that are planned to help the whole class, individuals, and groups of students. So you're considering the variety of learners again. And again, you need to read this box, consider the box, and then think outside the box. Do you have some advanced students in your classroom? Do you have some students who are great in reading, struggle a little bit in writing? They don't have to have been identified in order for you to help them out. So first of all, we're going to be talking about general supports for the whole class, which she does. And then here she gives rationale for her instructional supports for the whole class. At this point, she's giving research to support her use of anchor charts. She discusses interactive notebooks here. She could have made a really strong argument, but kind of left it, it was kind of fell flat on its face. It was a little bit of a dud. She could have done a little bit more with that. Again, I'm being a little picky just so that you can learn from this. This is someone who made a 5. So she did very well. Now they've moved to specific groups. She's describing a self-assessment as a way to identify students who struggle with this skill. I thought that was very good. I'm not sure I agree with the self-assessment, but I do like the fact that she has thought about how she's going to identify who's struggling. She talks about the use of small groups based on ability. And she describes a support for higher learning, higher students that are working at a higher level. And then she gives theoretical support for those small ability groups. Then she describes what I would consider to be general support for struggling learners. I'm not super impressed with what she came up with, but it didn't seem to hurt her on her score. She has supports for students with specific needs here. She describes the needs of one specific student and her plans to address those needs. She supports it with theory, and it's pretty strong. And I think that's probably taken her over the top there with the 5. She's got a common misconception that she's discussed she's not just stated what it is, she's explained it. I mean, it's very obvious. It's from what they're doing. It's very impressive. She talks about how to address that misconception, and then she goes on to point out an additional misconception, which almost seems like an afterthought. I'm not sure it was completely necessary. So this student has done a really good job. We can always learn from others. And even when they're doing great work like this student did, there's always room for improvement. And I'm sure that you will do just as well on prompts 2 and 3. I hope you have a great day.